You know, as I think about Psalms and talking to a class, I mean, we've got 150 Psalms in there. How do you do one class period on Psalms? And one of the things that I find my students interested in, maybe you do also, Andrew, is the whole question of how does a book that has prayers by psalmists to God become God's authoritative revelation to us? After all, the Psalms are often confused. How do you handle the confusion of the psalmists?
Well, I do like to frame and work with the Psalms in the context of worship, ultimately, and worship is about God and about response to God. So there's something there that's very important for us as we think about the Psalms in that context of worship.
Lots of times I find students are inclined to think about the Psalms as model prayers for them to give. And so I typically will bring out an example of one of the harsh lament psalms where they're saying very nasty things about their enemies, and then posing the question, do you think that God really wants us to pray like this? Do you find that that's an obstacle they have to get past?
I think it can be. I also think it's an opportunity as we think about who God is and how he works in the world. And the whole idea of that so-called imprecatory psalm, the cursing psalm, reminds us that vengeance belongs to God. It's not ours. And so again, it turns our focus Godward rather than towards humanity looking to avenge itself.
It shows us to have an interest in God's justice, that certainly we want God's justice to be done in the world, and that that's something that's legitimate to pray for. In that sense, Psalms gives us a lot of things that are legitimate things to pray for.
And I also think you talked about the psalmist being confused at times. That's life. Life is confusing and hard and difficult, and the Psalms give us permission, in a sense, to go to God and say, I'm confused, I'm troubled, I have some doubts here, help me out. And so I like the idea that the Psalms give us, in a sense, permission to take honest doubt to God.
Permission, that's a good word, because God gives us an idea of these are the things he's willing to hear from us.
That's right.
And that's a good thing, that we can pray those things. And in that sense, it's not so much that Psalms are model prayers, but they give us an idea of God's attentiveness to us.
And they also provide concepts and I think theology that's important, because even those psalms of lamentation, of lament, of complaint, they end up taking the psalmist to a place of praise and thanksgiving. And so there's movement, there's a trajectory that I think is very therapeutic and helpful as we think about spiritual life and development.
So in that sense, the Psalms can lead us in the directions that prayers ought to go. In that sense, they don't become model prayers themselves, although many of them certainly would be appropriate for us to pray. But that's not what they're there for. They're there to show us God. I find it interesting that when the disciples ask Jesus for a model prayer, he doesn't give them a psalm.
That's true. But in the prayer he gives them, there are so many psalm themes.
Yes.
God is Father. The importance of daily provision. God is provider. And so there are all these points of contact in that disciples' prayer with the Psalms in terms of at least the content.
So in the end, Psalms tells us, in terms of revelation of God, I'm here, I'm listening, I care.
And I'll respond.
And I'll respond.
Amen.